I'd like to say that we are delighted to be in Springfield, and we're even more ecstatic to have visited the Loy Museum of Fine Arts this afternoon. So this evening and till tomorrow morning, rather than me giving you my interpretation of prophecy, I would like to discuss the fundamental principles of prophecy. I would like to discuss, our objective would be to provide sound biblical principles for the correct interpretation of biblical prophecy. In other words, rather than me telling you what I think prophecy would look like, I'd like to show you 4 principles that once you understand them, they could be guideposts for you to correctly understand prophecy. So rather than directly discussing prophecy, we're going to discuss 4 principles that you first have to understand. And I'd like everybody to turn to Amos 3:7. Oh, I got to put my glasses on. That's why I couldn't see. Amos says, "Surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he revealeth his secrets unto his servants the prophets." So that's important, that God intends to reveal his secrets to his prophets. For our God, because he is true God, is the only being that can and does correctly predict future events. Just as King Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged. Let us all turn to Daniel 2:47. Now, you could read it up on the screen, but I prefer that you open the Bible yourself and you read it from your Bible rather than from the screen, because I think there's great advantage to reading from your Bible, and let the Bible become yours internally rather than, but I'll have the slides here if you want to get a little bit... All right, here we go. Daniel 2:47. The king answered unto Daniel and said, "Of a truth, it is that your God is a God of gods, and Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets. Only true God can do this." So rather than developing our own personal interpretation on prophecy, we hope to provide solid scriptural principles to achieve the correct interpretation on prophetic events. Now, this is true especially in the kind of stuff that we see on the internet, especially since 2014. Now, all kinds of religious interpretations in the last 3 or 4 years have popped up. Now, I don't know, how many browse the internet in here? Yeah, if you do, you can't help but come across these things. And especially in 2014, this man, he proclaimed himself the Caliph of all Islam. That means he is the spiritual leader of all Islam. This is ISIS. And as a result of that, since 1914, a lot of ideas have come up about Armageddon, the end of the world, such things as even astrology and astronomy. I don't know if you could see this, but the sun and the moon, the sun and the moon and Mercury and Saturn all lined up in a straight line, and that was a prediction of events of coming. And since 1914, 1916, they all expected Christ to come. 1917, Armageddon. The whole place is full of it. And it isn't just the Protestant world. There's also a portion of the Christadelphian world that has an imminent return of Christ based upon what ISIS was doing in the Middle East. Each proclaiming God's prophetic truth. And many were sucked into this vortex of prophetic biblical babbling. That's what I address it as. So how does one go about searching for God's prophetic truth? That's a good question. And you know, for Christadelphians, it's very simple. The same way we go about searching for God's doctrinal truth, that's the same way we go about searching for prophetic truth. So before drawing a conclusion about what is truth, one must base that truth upon an unquestionable, proven biblical principle or point. In other words, before you say X, you got to know what X equals Y. So you can't make a prediction unless you know you're on solid grounds. For example, in Ezekiel 18:3, we're all familiar, it says, "Behold, all souls are mine, as the soul of the Father, so also the soul of the Son is mine. The soul that sinneth, it shall die." That's a biblical truth. That's a basis to start off with. And the same thing can be said about Isaiah 53:12. "Therefore I will divide him," Christ, "a portion with the great, because he hath poured out his soul unto death." So here are two verses that say the soul died. So how can the churches of today then say that the soul is immortal, when Scripture plainly says the soul dies? So here's an example of, before you say that the soul is immortal, you got to have a foundation, biblical principles to show that the soul is immortal. And you never find the immortal soul in the Bible. So because you don't have that foundation, you can't draw a right conclusion that the soul is immortal. The Bible teaches that the soul dies. Therefore, the right conclusion is the soul is not immortal. So there's, I read the wrong way. Therefore, it is critical in determining truth to start with a correct biblical principle. If you want to know truth, you have to start off with a good, right principle. If you have the right principle, you can come to the right conclusion. So we're going to attempt to, if one starts with a faulty or incorrect principle, one will end up with a faulty or incorrect prophetic interpretation. Therefore, this is our objective. Therefore, we will attempt to identify 4 biblical principles for correctly identifying prophetic truth. That'll be our object for tonight and tomorrow morning. Now, the first principle that I believe I want to discuss is that Israel will not undergo a third national destruction, or Israel will not be diminished by 2/3 quantity. The second principle will be that Israel will have no protector, that Israel will be isolated from the nations of this world. Again, it's easy to state something, but then you got to prove it later on, and that's the object tonight and tomorrow, to prove these. But these are the 4 principles. The third principle is that Islam is not representative of Babylon, nor of the feet and toes of Daniel's image. And finally, the fourth principle is Daniel's metallic image represents Western civilization, and will provide evidence for that. You know, anybody can state a principle, but to prove a principle from the Bible, that's another story. That's what separates the men from the boys. Now, we will attempt to identify the first biblical principle for correctly identifying prophetic truth. It is that Israel will not undergo a third national destruction and will not be diminished by 2/3. Now, once you have this principle, then you could go on to prophecy. How does this affect prophecy? And that is a later on development. But if you understand this principle, then you're on solid ground. Now, there are only 2 verses used in support of the principle that Israel will have a 2/3 destruction or a 2/3 diminishing. There's only 2 verses in the Bible that seems to imply that that's possible. The 2 verses are Ezekiel 21:25, 3 overturnings, and 2, Jeremiah 30:7-10, Jacob's time of trouble. So let's discuss these 2 verses and see what correct conclusions we can draw. Now, let's turn to, go back. I want everybody to turn to Ezekiel 21:25. I'll read it. And thou, verse 25, and thou profane wicked prince of Israel, whose day is come, when iniquity shall have an end. Thus saith the Lord God, remove the diadem, take off the crown, and it shall not be the same. Exalt him that is low, and abase him that is high. And here's verse 27. I will overturn three overturnings, and it shall be no more until he come whose right it is, and I will give it him. So many respected Christadelphians have said that that this prince here spoken of in verse 25, this wicked prince, is the king Zedekiah, and therefore the three overturnings apply to the three overturnings of national Israel. The first overturning was by the Babylonians, the second overturning was by the Romans, and the third overturning will be by a future overturning in the Armageddon battles. We'll leave it at that. I don't want to go into more explanation than that. Now, that's one interpretation, that the prince here is King Zedekiah, and it applies to natural Israel. The second overturning is, which I will suggest, is that the three overturnings, that the prince here is the high priest of Israel, of the Levitical tribe, and the three overturnings are the three destructions of the three temples. They were Solomon's temple, Ezra and Nehemiah's temple, and Herod's temple. And after the third destruction of Herod's temple, there was no more temple until he comes whose right it is. So later I will provide the information. Now, why it cannot be King Zedekiah, natural Israel? Here's one point. It would be incorrect to address a reigning monarch as a prince. I mean, if you lived in his days and you called him prince, which was an inferior title, I doubt if you would stand in his court. A king is a king. He's not a prince. A prince is inferior to a king. So this here, whoever this address, is called a prince. Secondly, this prince wears a mishnefeth. I'll explain that later on, but that's important to understand. This king, this prince, whoever he is, has on his head this mishnefeth. And thirdly, he also has a crown, which is the regular crown that a king would wear. So here is this individual, this prince, who has something on his head, then on top of that something is a crown. Now, no king of Israel ever wore two types of crowns or headgears. They never did. At least we don't have any recording of that. And 4, it says, after the third overturning, his kingdom shall be no more. Now, if that's true, how do we explain the nation of Israel today? Because Israel exists. This says that after the third overturning, it shall be no more. There shall be no nation of Israel, or whatever you want. If this is the royal prince, then the kingdom of Israel shouldn't exist today. But it does. Now we suggest that the overwhelming evidence, and we consider overwhelming, is that this prince does not apply to King Zedekiah, natural Israel, but the high priest of the Levitical order, and the three overturnings are the three temples destroyed. Now, we read in Ezekiel 21:25. Let's read that verse 26 again. Thus saith the Lord, remove the diadem. Now, remove the diadem? What's a diadem? I doubt if... How many people know what a diadem is? That's the point. That's the point. That's exactly the point. And take off the crown. Now, who is this prince of Israel? And any head of each of the 12 tribes of Israel was a prince of Israel. Turn to Numbers 1, verses. Let's read that. Sometimes when you read something in the Bible, it's more effective than just reading it up here, because these are just, any man can put whatever he wants up on the screen. There's no authority behind a monitor, but scriptures is something else. We read verse 1, And the Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, the tabernacle of the congregation, the first day of the second month, and the second day after they were come out of the land of Egypt, saying. Then let's jump down to fourth verse. And with you there shall be a man of every tribe, every one head of the house of his father. And then verse 16. These were renowned of the congregation, princes of the tribes of their fathers, heads of thousands in Israel. And then drop down to verse 44. These are those that were numbered, which Moses and Aaron numbered, and the princes of Israel, being 12 men. So here are the princes of Israel. Israel had 12 princes, and every prince was the head of one of the 12 tribes. And the head of the Levitical tribe was the high priest. And this is the wicked prince of Israel. The high priest, as the head of the Levitical tribe, does qualify as a prince of Israel. That's important. The high priest is a prince of Israel, and he's called a wicked prince. Now we go back to Ezekiel. We read, remove the diadem. And the word diadem, here it is, mesnepheth. Now this word diadem is translated Hebrew. It occurs 12 times in the Old Testament. 11 times it is translated mitre, and always applies to the headgear exclusively worn by the high priest. Anybody that wore this diadem, this mitre, would have been instantly struck dead, because they were holy garments, they were holy things. Nobody could touch holy things. Only the high priest could wear this garment and not die. And it is only in Ezekiel 21:26 that it is translated as diadem. I could go into an explanation, but it would be complicated and I don't want to spend the time. But I'm saying that this is indisputable proof that the prince in Ezekiel 21 is talking about the high priest. That this prince can only be representative of the high priest, the Levitical order, and the three overturnings, the three destructions are of the three Jewish temple. That is Solomon's temple, Ezra's temple, and Herod's temple. And when he does come, he shall build a temple, and it shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. Now the second verse that's used to prove a 2/3 diminishing, a diminishing, they don't address it as 2/3 at this point, is found in Jeremiah 30:7-10. Let's turn to that. I also want to read that. This is called Jeremiah's time of trouble. See, now these are facts that we're dealing with. And once you have these facts straight, then you can go about determining whatever prophecy you want to determine, but at least have this as a solid foundation. And then you could proceed on to whatever prophetic understanding you want. In Jeremiah 30, let's start with verse 6. Ask ye now, and see whether a man doth travail with child. Whereof do I see every man with his hands on his loins, as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. Alas, for the day is great, so that there is none like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble. but he shall be delivered. He shall be stayed out of it. For it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord of hosts, that I will break the yoke from off thy neck, and I will bust thy bounds, and strangers shall no more serve themselves of him. This is many Christadelphians will use this verse as a time of Jacob's trouble that occurs in the Armageddon battles, in which either the traditional view or the futurist view have a 2/3 diminishing of Israel. And they use this as Jacob's time of trouble. Now, we've just read that. Therefore, and this what is in the 11th verse. I got to go back. I got to go back to the 10th. I don't have the 10th verse. All right. Let's read. Let's read Jeremiah 10. Therefore, fear thou not, O my servant Jacob, saith the Lord, neither be dismayed, O Israel, for lo, I will save thee from afar, and thy seed from the land of their captivity. And Jacob shall return and shall be at rest and be quiet, and none shall make him afraid. For I am with thee, saith the Lord, to save thee, though I make a full end of all nations whither I have scattered thee. Yet will I not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure. I will not leave thee altogether unpunished. Now, where is this occurring? Where is the time of Jacob's trouble? The majority of Christadelphians say it's in Israel. That's where the Armageddon is. That's where the Jews are going to be destroyed. 2/3 of them. And there's going to be a diminishing. But we read in verse 10, therefore fear thou not, O my Lord, my servant Jacob. Therefore fear thou not, my servant Jacob, saith the Lord. Neither be dismayed, O Israel, for I will save thee from afar, and thy seed from the land of their captivity. The time of Jacob's trouble occurs in the land of their captivity in Hitler's Europe. That's where the time of trouble for Israel was. So it was such a time as never was before, it says, as spoken of in Daniel 12:1. And that's when 2/3 of the Jews, where Hitler genocide 2/3 of the Jews in his European theater. There were 12 million Jews in Europe, and 6 million were destroyed. And by the way, a third of them were 1.5 million were little ones. But we'll discuss it at a later date. In any event, the time of Jacob's trouble does not occur in the land of Israel. It is in a land afar, in verse 11. Now, here's another interesting point. In the latter part of the 11th verse, it says, and I will correct him in measure, and I'll read it from here. And Jacob shall return to the land of Israel, and none shall make him afraid. Now, I've never been to Israel, but one thing that almost everybody that comes back from Israel says is that the Jews living in Israel are almost fearless. I mean, they drive like maniacs, I'm told, because they have no fear. Now, that's contrary. For the Jews living in a diaspora, it says that God gave them a trembling heart, unspeakable fear. But for the 1/3 remnant that returned, that were born in the land of Israel, God makes those Jews fearless. They shall not fear. Therefore, connecting Jacob's time of trouble, that the Jews that come back from the land of captivity, that they will be fearless. Now we ask, if Israel is to be diminished by a 2/3 amount in the future, and just ask anybody, what do you believe about that? Is it true or not? Ask him, how do you explain Psalms 112:16? Turn to that. Turn to the Psalms 112:16. Now, to me, this is a very potent verse. It says, what was that?
There aren't 16 verses in Psalm 112. Is it verse 6 maybe?
102 then, probably.
112:6 maybe?
Wait, let me check. Let me turn to, I don't know. See, the screen, you can never know what's, well, I'll check to my Bible. That's the best way.
102.
102, right? Yeah, okay. Absolutely, yeah. 102:16. Oh, that's the screen for you. I did it, but it's my problem. All right, Psalms 102 verse 16 says, when the Lord shall build up Zion, he shall appear in his glory. Think about that. When the Lord shall build up Zion, Christ appears in his glory. Now, from this verse, just prior to the second advent, are the Jews expected to diminish, or are they expected to increase? You tell me. Here's a fundamental principle. Use this principle to determine your understanding of prophecy. See, these are fundamental principles. Once you grasp them and have them under your belt, you could use them as an understanding of developing your own personal understanding of prophecy. So, we must make a sharp differences between what men teach about prophecy and the principles that Scriptures clearly teaches. Another point is found that in Isaiah 11:11, I didn't put the verse here, but if you turn to the 11th chapter of Isaiah, in verse 11, it says, and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again, the second time, to recover the remnant of his people. Now, does anybody question that the entire 11th chapter is messianic? Isn't the entire 11th chapter about Messiah? Of course it is. Everybody agrees to that. But this verse says that, and it shall come to pass in that day, that's got to be the day of Messiah, the second advent, that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people. Now, if this entire chapter is messianic and applies to the second advent, then the Lord sets his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of the diaspora. Now, the first scattering was by the Babylonians. The first recovery was under Ezra and Nehemiah. The second scattering was by the Romans. And the second recovery or regathering was, we could say, around 1948 with the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel. And then some say there's going to be a third scattering and a third regathering. This makes Christ, Messiah, associated with the third recovery. If there's a third scattering, there's got to be a third recovery. Isaiah 11:11 says that if there's a third destruction and a third diminishing and scattering, then Messiah must be associated with the third recovery. How can that be? How can there be a third recovery when Messiah is only associated with the second recovery? There's a principle. It's Isaiah 11:11. Now, Isaiah 11 is indisputable biblical proof that natural Israel will not undergo a third national destruction. So So we now come to the second biblical principle for correctly identifying prophetic truth, and that is that Israel will have no protector. Israel will be isolated. In other words, prophetic understanding is that Israel will have to have a nation that will protect it from its enemies. Now, for those who teach that, here was the man that first began this idea of a protector. His name is Theodor Herzl. I see that. I was looking for the clock, and there I see it right up there. I want to keep track of my time. Herzl was, he was the first Jewish secularist. Now that's the name of some people, some present organizations in Israel today. They believed in a Jewish state, an independent Jewish state that was democratic, and it was Jewish. Now Herzl, in his days, he was the rock star of Europe. He was as well known in Europe as the Beatles were in the 60s and 70s in America and Britain. I presume it was 60s, 70s. I don't know. I'm correct on that. Is it? All right. Well, anyway, that was comparable. He was that way. He was a trained lawyer, but he didn't like law. He didn't like to practice law. So he took long trips, and he began to write about his trips, and the papers picked it up, and he became... Throughout Europe, he became known, and even royalty would comment on his newspaper articles, and consequently, he was familiar with the correspondence with all the kings and royalties of Europe. And he saw through. There was a case called the Dreyfus Affair, in which France. I don't want to get into it, but anyway. As a lawyer, he felt that the reason why Dreyfus, who was a Jew, was being persecuted was that the Jewish people did not have their own homeland, did not have their own nation, did not have their own government. So he felt that if he could get the Jews their homeland, that all the prejudice against the Jews would go away. And his philosophy is known as the secularist philosophy. So we come to the second principle. Oh, wait a minute, I'm going backwards. I got a left and right. Okay, here we go. So Herzl was a household name and throughout all of Europe. Even royalty commenting on travel logs. Consequently, Herzl petitioned all of the crown heads of Europe looking for a protector for his future state of Israel. And the reason was that... I got ahead of myself. The reason was that in an era of everybody lived under colonialism, everybody wanted to gobble up every other country, and you stayed alive simply by having a strong army. And if you didn't have a protector for the future state of Israel, it would be swallowed up by the Arabs or whoever. So Herzl recognized that Israel needed a protector. And not only Herzl, Brother Thomas and a lot of other people recognized in the beginning that the Jewish state needed a protector in order to survive. Now Herzl, the thing about Herzl is that he was a secularist. He wasn't a theologian. He wasn't interested in the Bible. He was just a regular Jew with little desire for the Bible. So he first petitioned Germany, and Germany was eager to act as a protector. But then when Germany went to his friend, the king of Islam, the Caliph of Islam in Turkey, the guy blew up and said he would not have nothing to do with it. And then Kaiser Wilhelm reneged on his offer to be a protector for the Jews. And then eventually Britain offered to be a protector for the new state of Israel. However, Britain, what they offered was, they told Herzl, yes, we'll protect you, but we want Israel to live, to have their state in Uganda, Africa. Zion, he belonged to the Zionist organization. So, since it was the only offer that he had, he presented it, and the whole conference went in an uproar. And Herzl said that I've got 2 years before the next conference to change the mind of the delegates. And 6 months after Herzl proposed his Uganda Africa plan as the national homeland for the Jews, Herzl unexpectedly passed away from a heart attack. So passed away the Uganda Africa plan for the Jewish homeland in Africa. However, Herzl, like everyone else, including Brother Thomas, did recognize that in an era of colonialism, a protector for a future fledgling state of Israel would be paramount. Without it, you would have no state of Israel. Now, again, the only verse that can be used in support of a protector for a Jewish state is Isaiah 16:4. Let's turn to it. Let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab. Be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler. For the extortioner is at an end, the spoiler ceaseth, the oppressors are consumed out of the land. And this is the only verse that has a covert. Now that word covert means a protector. Be thou a covert to them, that is Israel. While Britain in World War II did have the mandate, the control over Palestine, it never protected the Jews, nor the Jewish state. On the contrary, history tells us that it always sided with the Arabs against the Jewish people. Now here's the important thing about Isaiah 16:4. Every other version of Isaiah 16:4, that means the Masoretic Hebrew text, the Greek Septuagint text, the Aramaic text, and any other translation you want to get, it doesn't matter. In Isaiah 16:4, they all have Israel protecting Moab. It's only our King James Version that has Moab protecting Israel. So the supposedly scriptural principle that Moab will protect Israel is without a biblical foundation. Again, this is a principle. If you say that X is going to happen, where is the biblical verse for proving X? You got to have a foundation, a principle, before you can make a statement. And before you can say that Moab will protect Israel, where is that verse? It's not in Isaiah 16:4, that I can assure you. Now the third principle that we want to cover is that Islam is not representative of Babylon. You know, we talked a lot about Islam and the Arab people, first Babylon. Now, especially since 2014, we saw this slide again. If you go on the internet, it's full. You have everybody's talking about an imminent return of Christ. Wait a minute. You know, very highly respected people, authors all over the place. They have a 14, 16, 17. There's another one, 17 here, and they're all saying the Advent is near because. And here's the reason why. Because the Arabs have rebuilt ancient Babylon. Islam is the Babylon of Revelation 17. Islam is the head of gold. And ISIS has proclaimed itself the Caliph. So, based upon the principle that ancient Babylon has been rebuilt by the Arab people, then the conclusion is made that ancient Babylon, Islam, is the Babylon harlot that rides the beast of Revelation 17. Now, we think not for the following reason. In Revelations 1:1 it says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants. Again, it's the servants that have this knowledge of secrets. Things which must shortly come to pass. The servants of Christ are in a better position to have a correct understanding of prophecy, much, 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 much better than the world out there. Don't trust it that much, because it's to his servants that God reveals his secrets. And that's in the first chapter. And then in the last chapter it says, and he said unto me, the Lord God sent his angels to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. Now, everything that is contained between the first and last chapter of Revelations must shortly, in type form or in reality, come to pass within a short time from John's writing. Now, how could the majority of Revelations be filled with respect to Islam when Muhammad, the beginning of Islam, did not come into existence till around 650 AD? If Islam is the Babylon of Revelation, what does one do with the following three verses? Pay attention to these three verses. Jeremiah 51:24, and because of time we'll just read them. I will render unto ancient Babylon, I added ancient, I will render unto Babylon, unto all the inhabitants of Chaldea, all their evil that they have done in Zion. Behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord. Babylon, ancient Babylon. Verse 37, Babylon shall become heaps, a dwelling place for jackals, an astonishment and a hissing, without an inhabitant, that they may sleep a perpetual sleep, and not awake, saith the Lord. And then 57, I will make drunk her princes, her wise men, her captains, her rulers, mighty men, and they shall sleep a perpetual sleep, and not awake, saith the King, whose name is the Lord of hosts. Now, if ancient Babylon is to sleep a perpetual sleep and not awake, how can she arise and become the active Babylon of Revelations? There's a major conflict there. There's a principle. Now, as far as Islam being the feet and toes of Daniel's image, for both the Protestant and Christadelphian futurists, I don't know if I want to get into maybe I will tomorrow, but for now we'll let it go. Their major evidence that Daniel's feet and toes is representative of an Islamic entity is that the word Arab is mentioned 3 times in Daniel 2. And this is Daniel 2:42. It says, and whereas thou sawest the feet and the toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom of men shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron. We suggest the iron is Western civilization. We'll again go into it a little bit. For as much as thou sawest that the iron mixed. Now the word for mixed is Hebrew Arab with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, the kingdoms of men shall consist partly strong and partly broken, weak. And whereas thou sawest the iron mixed, Hebrew Arab, with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed, Hebrew Arab, with clay. The ancient Hebrew word Arab was always used as a verb. That a verb shows action. That's what it is. indicating indicating the action of mixing things as one would mix a salad. That's what Arab means. After Abraham, and beginning with his son Ishmael, who sold his birthright, Ishmael chose to mix Arab himself through intermarriage with the heathen women, and therefore became the first of the Arabic employed as a noun people. In Ishmael's case, the verb Hebrew, Arab, came to be understood as the noun Arab, representing the Arabic people. These were people who at one time were related to Father Abraham, but rejected the Abrahamic promises and mixed themselves, became Arab themselves with the people of this world. So here's the conclusion of Arab as a verb and Arab as a noun. In the grammatical context of Daniel, and without any question, indicates that the Hebrew word Arab is employed as a verb and not as a noun, Arab. Therefore, the hypothesis that the feet and toes of Daniel's metallic image are representative of an Islamic entity must be abandoned. So those are the three principles that we have covered tonight. And tomorrow I'd like to address the fourth principle, that Daniel's metallic image represents the Western civilization.